The stars in the galaxy shimmered with a cold, distant light. For centuries, peace had reigned among the countless civilizations that called the Milky Way home. From the peaceful worlds of the Asari to the formidable warships of the Zorith, there was an understanding that balance must be maintained, that the fires of war would never consume the galaxy again. That was until the Imperium arrived. Far beyond the edge of the known territories, deep in the uncharted regions, an ancient and formidable fleet emerged. Massive warships of unknown design, unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, sliced through the fabric of space, their dark hulls gleaming like obsidian in the void. These ships were not from any empire, race, or culture that had ever existed in the galaxy before. The Imperium had come. For generations they had watched from afar, studying the galaxy, biding their time. Now their invasion was imminent, and no one was prepared for what was to come. Commander Xantha Theron of the Federation's Starfleet sat in the command chair of the Horizon, the Federation's most advanced dreadnought. Her fingers ran over the cold surface of the console, her mind racing. The information from the scout ships was clear, but it was impossible to believe. The Imperium had breached the galactic boundary, and they were coming in full force. All communication attempts to make contact had been met with silence. Any word from the Senate? Xantha's voice was low, but the tension was palpable. Her executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Kale Maris, shook his head, his expression grim. Nothing. They've issued a general mobilization order, but we don't have specifics. It's as if we're waiting for something, some key event that will tell us what comes next. He paused, looking out at the stars through the viewport. We're facing an enemy we know nothing about, Commander. And our resources are already stretched thin from the recent conflicts along the border. Xantha clenched her jaw, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. The Federation had been in a fragile state, ever since the disintegration of the Valken League. A full-scale war with an unknown species could shatter everything they had worked for. Then we prepare for the worst, Xantha said, standing from her chair. Assemble the fleet. We need to meet them head-on before they can establish a foothold in our systems. Maris nodded, though his face betrayed his concern. And what if they're not here for war? Xantha turned her steely gaze on him. Then we'll find out soon enough. Meanwhile, light years away, the Imperium warships loomed over the fringes of Federation space, their vast hulls cutting through the darkness with terrifying precision. At the heart of the fleet was the flagship Dominus, a ship so large it could eclipse an entire planet. On board the Dominus, the Imperium's High Commander, Relith, stood on the command deck, his eyes fixed on the swirling expanse of stars. The galaxy before him was filled with potential. The Imperium had once ruled a vast empire, but its civilization had fallen into a cataclysmic collapse centuries ago. Only fragments of their former glory remained, scattered across the stars, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The time had come. Relith's piercing gaze swept over the alien worlds in front of him, the Federation's territories. He knew that the galaxy's factions had grown complacent, their unity fractured by internal struggles. That weakness was a gift, a crack in the armor of a once proud civilization. And he would exploit it. Activate the phase cannons, Relith ordered, his voice cold and commanding. The crew members around him moved in unison, working to initiate the activation sequence. The phase cannons were the Imperium's most fearsome weapon, capable of disintegrating entire fleets with a single shot. But Relith had no intention of using them yet. The true power of the Imperium lay in their ability to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. It was only a matter of time before the Federation would have no choice but to bend the knee. His eyes flicked to the massive tactical map on the wall, showing the Federation's capital world, Valora Prime, sitting vulnerably on the edge of their influence. The Imperium would not rest until it had claimed that world as its own. And once they had it, the galaxy would be theirs to control. But Relith's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden report. Commander, we've detected Federation fleet movements at the edge of the system. They've begun to assemble. Relith's lips curled into a grim smile. So, they've decided to fight after all. It would be the first battle of many, a skirmish that would set the stage for the war to come. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and the Imperium's return was only the beginning. The Federation fleet was assembling at the outer rim of their territory, their ships forming a blockade in an attempt to guard their most strategic systems. Commander Xantha Theron stood at the helm of the Horizon, staring out at the vast expanse of space, where the first of the Imperium ships had appeared. The sight of them was enough to send a shiver down anyone's spine. Their immense size, their dark, angular hulls, it was as if the stars themselves feared them. "Captain, our fleet is in position," Lieutenant Commander Kale Maris reported. His voice was steady, though the uncertainty was evident in his eyes. Xantha nodded, gripping the armrests of her chair. Good. Now we wait for their move. I don't care if they want to talk or conquer. We need to show them that the Federation won't be easily intimidated. Yes, Commander, Maris replied, and Xantha could hear the underlying doubt in his voice. He was still trying to make sense of it all. From the command deck of the Horizon, Xantha could see the tactical readouts of their approaching enemy. The Imperium warships had begun to deploy their fleet in a formation that suggested an immediate strike. But the question remained, why were they so silent? No messages had been transmitted, no demands for surrender, nothing. It was as if the Imperium had one singular goal, the Federation's destruction. Suddenly the entire ship lurched violently, throwing Xantha forward against the control panel. She gritted her teeth as sparks flew from the systems, and alarms began blaring throughout the ship. Report. Xantha shouted, regaining her balance as the Horizon trembled under another barrage. Phase cannons. Maris yelled. They've fired on us. Direct hit to our starboard flank. Shields holding, but we're taking heavy damage. Xantha's eyes flashed with fury. The Imperium hadn't come to talk. They had come to destroy. Raise shields to full power. Return fire with everything we have, she commanded. The Horizon's cannons flared to life, sending brilliant beams of energy racing toward the nearest Imperium ship. But the enemy ships were swift, faster than anything the Federation had ever encountered. The enemy vessels dodged and weaved with uncanny precision, firing their own devastating energy blasts in retaliation. It was clear they had the upper hand in terms of firepower and speed. We can't keep this up for long, Maris warned. We're outgunned. Xantha's mind raced. She needed more time for the rest of the fleet to arrive and time for her crew to regroup. But the Imperium wasn't giving them that luxury. Divert all power to the aft shields. We're going to retreat, but not without making them feel it, Xantha ordered. With quick precision, the crew executed her command, and the Horizon swung to the side, narrowly dodging another powerful volley. The ship's engines roared to life as they powered up, making a strategic withdrawal toward the nearby asteroid belt. The Federation fleet, though damaged, followed closely behind, eager to escape the deadly reach of the Imperium's cannons. Back on the Dominus, Relith stood at the tactical console, watching as the Federation's flagship fled. His expression remained unreadable. They're retreating, one of his officers said. Relith's lips curled into a cold, almost imperceptible smile. Let them run. They will never escape the inevitable. Elsewhere in the galaxy, on a remote world far from the front lines, a team of Federation scientists worked feverishly in a hidden underground facility. The discovery of an ancient artifact, a remnant from a long-forgotten war, had revealed something that could shift the balance of power in the galaxy. It was a weapon, a powerful one, and one that had been buried for centuries to ensure it would never fall into the wrong hands. Dr. Elise Valora, a leading scientist in the Federation's research division, stood over the artifact with a mixture of awe and trepidation. She didn't know the full extent of its power, but its markings were unmistakable. The Imperium had used something like it once. It's a phase rift generator, she whispered to herself as she activated the device. A low hum filled the room, and before her stood a swirling distortion in the fabric of space. The rift was unstable, dangerous. But in the right hands it could be a game-changer. A weapon capable of disrupting the Imperium's advanced technology and giving the Federation a fighting chance. We have to make sure the fleet gets this information, Dr. Valora said, looking to her team. If they're to survive this, they'll need more than just conventional weapons. Back in the heart of the battle, the Horizon continued its retreat, its shields flickering as they absorbed yet another round of enemy fire. Xantha stared ahead, knowing that this was only the beginning. She couldn't afford to let the Imperium push them back any further. The Federation had one chance to fight back, and they had to take it. As the Horizon entered the asteroid belt, Xantha's tactical console blinked with a new message. It was a distress signal from the Federation's outer colonies. The Imperium was already attacking at multiple points across the galaxy. Xantha closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the situation sink in. The fate of the galaxy was in their hands and she would not let it slip through her fingers. We fight for our future, she muttered under her breath. The war had begun. The Horizon limped through the asteroid field, its damaged hull trailing smoke, and its weapon systems flickering in and out of power. Commander Xantha Theron gripped the armrests of her chair, her knuckles turning white as she stared at the strategic display on the command console. The Imperium fleet had already struck at several Federation colonies, but it was Valora Prime, the Federation's capital, that was their most vital target. The Imperium wasn't just after a victory, they were after the heart of the Federation. "Commander, we're receiving multiple distress signals from Valora Prime," Lieutenant Commander Kale Maris said, his voice tight with urgency. "The Imperium's fleet is already in orbit." Xanda's heart sank. The Federation couldn't afford to lose its capital, not when the galaxy was on the brink of chaos. "Send a priority transmission to all nearby fleets," she ordered. "We need reinforcements. Now." She turned toward the view screen. The stars, cold and distant, seemed to mock her in this moment of weakness. But there was no time for doubt. No time for hesitation. The Federation was on the edge of collapse and she had to stop it. "Sir, the fleet is outnumbered," Maris said, his gaze still focused on the tactical readout. "We need to make a stand, but we don't have the firepower to engage the full Imperium fleet head-on." Xanda glanced at the smaller, more specialized vessels that made up the bulk of their fleet. Light cruisers, reconnaissance ships, and the few remaining heavy destroyers. Their odds of winning in a straight-up confrontation were slim at best. Yet, in her heart, Xanda knew there was only one option left. "Prepare a diversionary maneuver," she said, a fierce determination in her voice. "We'll split the fleet. The larger ships will create a wall of fire to distract their flagship. We'll take the horizon and the light cruisers around the perimeter to strike at their supply lines." Maris hesitated for a moment. "Commander, it's risky. We don't know what their fleet's full capabilities are yet. And the Dominus is." "I know what we're up against," Xanda interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "But Valora Prime cannot fall. If we lose the heart of the Federation, there will be nothing left to fight for." Maris didn't need further convincing. "Aye, Commander. We'll execute the plan." On board the Dominus, High Commander Relith stood in the center of the command deck, watching the Federation's movements with cold detachment. The tactical map in front of him showed the Federation fleet scattering into smaller formations, attempting to buy time while their capital was attacked. Relith had anticipated this strategy, and he had already prepared for it. "Deploy the phase cannons," Relith ordered, his voice steady as ever. "Cripple their larger ships and let them scatter. The Dominus will take Valora Prime." A low hum reverberated through the Dominus as its cannons powered up, the immense energy weapons primed to obliterate the Federation's capital. Relith glanced at the tactical console again, his mind already calculating his next move. The Federation might be fractured, but they still had resources. The Horizon would be a troublesome opponent, and he knew that its commander, Xanda Theron, would be a problem. A leader with skill and grit was never easy to defeat. "Send a message to the Horizon," Relith instructed, a slow, calculating smile playing on his lips. "Let's see if they'll surrender before their people are destroyed." Back on the Horizon, Xanda stood with her arms crossed, watching the starfield outside as the ship's engines roared to life, propelling them toward Valora Prime at maximum speed. The battle had taken on a new urgency now. The Imperium's flagship, the Dominus, was already moving toward the planet, and if they didn't act quickly, it would be too late to stop them. "Commander, we've got a transmission from the Dominus," Maris said, his tone cautious. "It's a message from Relith." Xanda's jaw clenched. She wasn't surprised. The Imperium had made it clear they wanted the Federation to bow before them. "Put it through," she said, her voice unwavering. The screen flickered and Relith's calm, unflinching face appeared. His piercing eyes locked onto Xanda's, and for a brief moment, it felt like the weight of the entire galaxy rested on this one conversation. "Commander Theron," Relith's voice was smooth and measured, like a predator toying with its prey. "You can end this now. Surrender your fleet in the capital. I'll spare your people. There's no need for more bloodshed." Xanda's heart raced, but she didn't flinch. "And what happens to those who refuse?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. Relith's smile was cold. "They die. And then your Federation dies with them." There was a long pause before Xanda spoke again. "The Federation will never surrender to you, Relith. Not now, not ever." She cut the transmission. No more words were needed. "All ships, prepare for battle." Xanda shouted, her voice carrying through the ship. "We fight for Valora Prime. We fight for our people." The Horizon shuddered as it entered weapons range, its pulse cannons firing in quick succession, sending arcs of energy toward the Imperium fleet. The battle for the fate of the Federation was about to begin in earnest, and Xanda would stop at nothing to ensure that her people did not fall. Elsewhere, underground on Valora Prime, Dr. Elise Valora paced anxiously in her lab, her mind racing. She had just received word from the Federation's command that the Imperium's fleet was already at the capital's doorstep. But there was one last card to play, one that could give the Federation a chance to turn the tide. The phase rift generator was unstable, but in the chaos of battle, it might be their only hope. She knew the risks, but what choice did they have? "I'll get this to the fleet," Dr. Valora muttered, determination etched on her face. "It's our only shot." The battle raged outside the atmosphere of Valora Prime, a fierce clash of titanic forces between the Federation and the Imperium. Explosions rocked the void, lighting up the starfield in brilliant bursts of energy. The horizon weaved through the chaos, its hull battered but still holding strong. Zan the Theron stood resolute in the heart of the conflict, her eyes locked on the tactical display as her fleet fought to protect the capital. "Shields at 30%. Maris called out, his voice tense as the crew worked frantically to keep the horizon intact. "Return fire. All turrets, focus on the Dominus," Xantha commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. She gripped the armrests of her chair as another tremor ran through the ship, the shockwaves of enemy fire shaking the hull. Her eyes never wavered from the monitor. The Imperium fleet was relentless, their warships moving with deadly precision. But Xantha knew that this battle wasn't just about power, it was about resolve. The Federation couldn't afford to lose Valora Prime. If the capital fell, the heart of their civilization would crumble, and the galaxy would fall under the cold, iron grip of the Imperium. "We've got reinforcements on the way," Maris said, though his voice lacked conviction. "But they're still several hours out. We won't last that long if we can't push them back." Xantha's mind raced. Time was running out. She couldn't wait for reinforcements. Not anymore. "Deploy the fighter squads," she ordered. "We'll need to take out their smaller ships and disrupt their formation. Get me a direct line to the vanguard." A moment later, the screen shifted, showing the face of Captain Lyra Jalin, the commander of the Federation's elite fighter wing. "Captain Jalin, I need you to break their lines. Hit their cruisers and give us an opening to strike at the Dominus," Xantha ordered. "Acknowledged, Commander," Jalin replied with a steely determination. "We'll make it happen." On board the Dominus, Relith stood at the center of his command deck, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the Federation fleet struggle against his forces. The Dominus fired its phase cannons with precision, tearing apart Federation destroyers and crippling their lines. His fleet was crushing them, but there was something unsettling about the way the Federation was fighting back. There was a spark of defiance in their eyes. "Deploy the dreadnoughts to secure Valora Prime," Relith commanded, his voice cold. "I want the capital taken. Now." His officers moved quickly to comply, and the tactical screen displayed a new formation. Massive warships that dwarfed the Federation's defenses. These ships were designed for planetary sieges, their weaponry capable of tearing through any defenses that might be in place. "Commander, we've detected a spike in energy readings," one of his officers reported. "It's coming from the Federation's flagship." Relith's eyes narrowed as he turned to face the screen. "They're trying something," he muttered. "Whatever it is, I'll make sure they regret it." Back on the horizon, Xantha felt the shift in the air as the Federation's fighter wings launched into battle. The dogfights were fierce, the sky above Valora Prime now alive with streaks of fire as the fighters engaged the Imperium's own fleets of interceptors and bombers. The horizon fired another salvo at the Dominus, but the enemy flagship was proving to be more resilient than she had anticipated. Every shot that hit seemed to have little effect. "Captain, we've got incoming," shouted a crew member from the weapons console. The proximity alarms blared again as Relith's dreadnoughts closed in, positioning themselves for a direct attack on the planet. Xantha's gaze sharpened. She could feel the walls closing in. Full evasive maneuvers. "Get us between the dreadnoughts and the capital. We'll have to buy time until reinforcements arrive." Just as she spoke, a sudden, unfamiliar signal flickered on her screen. A transmission that wasn't from the Imperium or Federation. "Commander, you need to see this," Maris said, his voice tinged with curiosity. The screen shifted to reveal a glowing, unstable rift in space. It wasn't like any weapon she had ever seen. It pulsed with raw energy, a distortion in the fabric of space itself. "What in the galaxy is that?" Xantha muttered, her mind racing as she studied the anomaly. "It's coming from Valora Prime," Maris said. "It's the phase rift generator. The scientists have activated it." Xantha's stomach churned. The phase rift generator was a weapon of unimaginable power, a relic from a time long past. It could disrupt entire fleets, throw enemy ships into unstable folds of space, and create chaos in the battlefield. But it was a gamble. If they couldn't control it, the entire battle could spiral into catastrophe. "They're activating it," Xantha said, her voice tight. "We have to stop them from overloading it." On the surface of Valora Prime, Dr. Elise Valora stood in the control room of the underground facility, her hand trembling as she reached for the final controls. The phase rift generator hummed louder, its unstable energy beginning to warp the air around her. Sweat dripped down her brow as she double-checked the systems. "We don't have much time," one of her assistants warned. "The rift is becoming more unstable. If we don't stabilize it soon, it could tear apart everything around it." "I know," Dr. Valora said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We need to make sure this works or it will all be for nothing. The Federation will fall without it." She pressed the final button, sending a surge of energy into the rift. For a moment, everything was still. And then, the rift pulsed, brighter than ever before. The skies above Valora Prime shimmered with an otherworldly glow, as if space itself had torn open. On board the horizon, Xantha felt the ship shudder as the rift activated. The entire fleet seemed to freeze in place, the energy from the rift distorting everything around them. Ships faltered in their movement as the fabric of space twisted in unpredictable ways. "We need to get out of here," Maris shouted. "The rift's energy is affecting our systems." Xantha's eyes widened in realization. "It's disrupting everything, our weapons, our shields, our engines." She looked toward Valora Prime, where the rift was pulsing violently. If they couldn't regain control soon, everything would be lost. "Prepare for emergency maneuvers," she shouted, hoping their fleet would have just enough time to escape the rift's chaotic pull. But the Imperium fleet was in the same peril. Relithus' flagship, the Dominus, faltered as the rift's energy coursed through its systems. This wasn't just a weapon, it was an equalizer. And in that moment, the tides of war had shifted. The entire battlefield had become a maelstrom of energy, light, and chaos. Xantha Theron clung to the control panel of the horizon as the ship bucked violently under the effects of the phase rift generator. The space around them warped, twisting like a living entity, distorting time and space itself. The Federation fleet was struggling to maintain any semblance of order, their systems flickering in and out of operation. "Commander, the rift's gravitational pull is intensifying," Lieutenant Commander Maris shouted from the tactical console. "Our shields are failing. We're losing control of our trajectory." Xantha's eyes darted from the tactical readouts to the starry expanse outside. The phase rift was affecting everything: ships, weapons, even the very fabric of space itself. In an instant, the battle had shifted from a coordinated defense to pure survival. "We can't fight it," Xantha muttered. "We need to pull back. Now." But as she spoke, a sudden explosion rocked the horizon, throwing her off balance. The lights flickered, and the ship groaned under the pressure of the rift's energy. The rift wasn't just pulling them in, it was tearing the fleet apart. "Report," Xantha ordered, regaining her footing. Maris looked up from his console, his face pale. "The Vanguard has lost power, engine failure. The Sentinel is being pulled into the rift. And the Dominus." Xantha's heart skipped a beat. She turned to the viewport, her gaze fixed on the Dominus. The massive Imperium flagship, once a symbol of terrifying strength, was now caught in the same gravitational chaos. Its once mighty cannons were now silent, its vast hull drifting aimlessly. The rift had destabilized everything. Are we in control?" Maris asked, fear creeping into his voice. Xantha didn't answer immediately. She felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. The rift had thrown every calculation and plan they had made into disarray. The very laws of physics seemed to be unraveling before her eyes. "We're not," Xantha replied at last, her voice low. "But we will be." On board the Dominus, Relithus' fist slammed into the console in front of him, sending a jolt of frustration through his body. His fleet, the core of the Imperium's power, was being torn apart. His flagship, the Dominus, had once been invulnerable. But now, it was drifting helplessly, its systems failing one by one as the phase rift destabilized every part of their technology. "Commander, the rift's energy is overwhelming the ship's systems," one of his officers reported, his voice trembling. "The Dominus can't hold much longer." Relithus' cold eyes narrowed. The battle had not gone as planned. The Federation had always been predictable in its tactics, but this, a sudden, unanticipated factor, was something beyond his control. And that irritated him more than anything. "We need to regain control," Relith shouted. "Send teams to the power core. I want full power to the main engines. We are not losing this ship." but his orders were met with silence. His crew was scrambling, unable to even communicate effectively as the rift's influence caused their systems to glitch. His voice, once a symbol of command, now felt powerless. "Commander Relith, we are being pulled in," another officer called, his voice strained with panic. "The rift's event horizon is closing. If we don't escape now, we'll be trapped." Relith's face remained an impassive mask, but inside, the seeds of doubt began to take root. This was not just a battle. This was something far more dangerous. His empire had been built on precision, control, and fear. But in the face of this unknown force, the Imperium was vulnerable. He slammed his fist into the control panel again, this time in a futile attempt to regain control. The Dominus drifted into the rift's growing power, becoming just another casualty in an impossible war. On Valora Prime, Dr. Elise Valora stood in the heart of the Federation's underground facility, sweat beading on her forehead as she monitored the increasingly unstable energy readings of the phase rift generator. The rift's pulsating energy surged out of control, disrupting both the battlefield and the planet's very core. Her team scrambled, desperately trying to maintain some semblance of stability. "Doctor, the rift is destabilizing," one of her assistants reported, voice tinged with fear. "If it continues at this rate, it will consume Valora Prime along with everything around it." Dr. Valora's pulse quickened, but she knew that there was no turning back now. The rift was the Federation's last hope. There had been no other choice. But now, as she watched the readings flicker ominously, she realized just how close they were to disaster. "We need to stabilize it," she said, her voice steady, though her insides were churning. "Do whatever you can to contain the energy." The assistant nodded and began working frantically at the console. But in the back of her mind, Dr. Valora knew that they might already be too late. The rift was pulling in everything in its path, ships, energy, even entire star systems. If they couldn't fix it in time, it would destroy the very fabric of the galaxy. Back on the horizon, Xanda gripped the armrests of her chair, her eyes scanning the distorted view screen as the rift's influence reached its peak. Her ship was still holding together, but only just. The Federation fleet was in tatters, many ships either disabled or completely lost to the energy of the rift. "Commander, we're being pulled toward the event horizon," Maris reported. "Our thrusters are malfunctioning, we can't escape the rift." Xanda's gaze remained focused, her heart racing in her chest. If they couldn't break free from the rift's pull, they would be trapped, just like the Dominus. "Prepare the auxiliary thrusters," Xanda commanded. "We have one chance to break free. Activate every ounce of power we've got. Full thrust, now." The ship shuddered as the auxiliary thrusters roared to life, struggling against the rift's gravitational forces. But the Horizon's engines were beginning to fail. The ship lurched violently as the pull of the rift grew stronger. For a moment, Xanda felt a surge of panic rise in her chest. Then, just as quickly, it was replaced by cold determination. They would not fall like this. "Hold on, everyone," Xanda said, her voice calm and firm. "We're getting out of here. We're not done yet." The rift's power surged once more. The entire battlefield twisted as space itself seemed to collapse inward. The Federation ships, the Imperium warships, and the planet of Valora Prime, all were caught in the energy's spiraling pull. The galaxy's fate now rested in the hands of those who would dare to survive this rift, and use it to their advantage. Would the Federation survive this disaster, or would they be consumed by the forces they had unleashed? The horizon shook violently as the rift's power surged through the ship. Every system on board screamed in protest, their functionality slipping away in the chaotic maelstrom of warping space. Xanda Theron's fingers gripped the control panel, her knuckles white as she fought to maintain control of the ship. The rift's gravitational forces were relentless, dragging everything into its dark, pulsating core. "We're losing thrusters," Maris shouted, his voice strained. "The engines can't hold up much longer." Xanda's mind raced. The auxiliary thrusters were barely keeping them in place, and the rest of the fleet was no better off. The Dominus had disappeared from the tactical screens, lost in the swirling chaos of the rift's event horizon. The Federation ships were scattered, many crippled, their systems failing one by one. If they didn't escape the rift's pull soon, they'd all be gone. But there was a spark of hope. "Lieutenant, do we still have the emergency beacon?" Xanda asked, her voice steady despite the madness unfolding around her. Maris's face lit up with understanding. "Yes, Commander, it's still operational." "Send out a distress signal to the fleet," Xanda commanded. "We need reinforcements. If we don't make it out of here, someone has to know what happened." "On board the Dominus." Relith's face twisted with fury as his flagship careened into the heart of the rift. His once great warship was now helpless, its engines failing, weapons offline, and shields shattered. The power of the rift was too much for even the Dominus to withstand. The walls of the command deck flickered with erratic lights, and the entire ship groaned under the strain. "We are losing control of the ship," one of his officers reported, his voice panicked. "The rift is tearing us apart. We can't escape." Relith slammed his fist on the console, his cold, calculating mind frantically searching for a solution. But there was nothing. His greatest weapon, his pride and joy, was now at the mercy of the rift. "Activate the emergency escape pods," Relith ordered through clenched teeth. "Get everyone off this ship now." He turned away from the command deck as the chaos unfolded around him, and though he had the power to escape the doomed flagship, the dark weight of failure hung heavily upon him. This defeat would not only be personal but would tarnish the name of the Imperium forever. "Leave the Dominus behind," he muttered bitterly, the thought of abandoning his fleet causing a deep wound within him. But survival came first. "I will rebuild. The Imperium will rise again. On Valora Prime." Dr. Elise Valora's heart raced as she watched the rift's destructive pull tighten around the planet's surface. The phase rift generator was still active, its unstable energy threatening to tear the world apart. She had no time to fix it, no time to save the people who lived above. Her team worked frantically at the consoles, desperately trying to regain control. But the rift's power was too strong. The underground facility was shaking, alarms blaring as the earth trembled beneath them. "Doctor, the rift's event horizon is expanding," one of her assistants shouted, barely audible over the din. "We can't stop it." "I know," Dr. Valora snapped, her voice cracking under the pressure. "But we need to contain it or the entire galaxy will be affected." Her mind raced. The Federation could not afford to lose Valora Prime, and yet they couldn't afford to lose everything else either. The rift could swallow entire sectors of space if they couldn't stabilize it. But there was no time. The rift's energy was consuming everything around it, and soon Valora Prime itself would be lost. Back on the horizon, Xanda's fingers danced over the console, her eyes scanning the rapidly deteriorating situation. She could feel the pull of the rift growing stronger, more intense. Her crew, her fleet, and her people were all at risk. It was a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. "Commander, the emergency beacon has been sent out," Maris reported, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "But I don't know if anyone will get it in time." Xanda's jaw clenched. "Time. The one thing they had so little of." "Prepare for a full jump to the nearest Federation relay station," she ordered. "We have to get out of here." Maris hesitated. "Commander, the rift's gravity is pulling us in faster than our engines can handle. If we initiate a jump now, the strain on the warp drive will rip us apart." "Do it anyway," Xanda snapped. "We don't have another choice." Maris quickly relayed the command to the engineering deck, and the ship groaned as the engines powered up. The crew fought against the overwhelming odds as they tried to stabilize their trajectory long enough to initiate the jump. Xanda looked up at the flickering stars beyond the viewport, knowing that they were on the edge of a precipice. The rift could swallow them whole, or it could spit them out into an entirely different corner of the galaxy. Either way, it would change everything. In the heart of the rift was no longer just a mysterious anomaly. It was alive, consuming all in its path. The gravitational forces twisted and warped everything, ships, stars, even time itself. The horizon shuddered, its warp drive straining to break free of the rift's powerful pull. Then, as if by sheer will, Xanda felt the engine surge forward, the rift's influence growing weaker, though still overwhelming. Their escape wasn't guaranteed, but the Federation ship was fighting back with every ounce of power it had left. Suddenly, the stars outside warped as the ship shot forward, a brilliant streak of energy as the horizon and its fleet entered a chaotic, unstable jump. Xanda held her breath. The ship lurched violently again, and for a split second, the world around her seemed to stretch, then snap back as though reality itself was being torn in two. Then everything went black. Elsewhere in the galaxy, a Federation relay station blinked to life with a sudden burst of energy. A faint, fragmented distress signal came through, garbled but unmistakable. "This is Horizon Rift. Prime needs help." The message was barely coherent, but it was enough. The Federation was still alive. Somewhere far beyond, the scattered remains of the Imperium fleet had all but vanished, lost to the rift. Yet, somewhere in the darkness of space, survival clung to the Federation and to Xanda Theron, who had defied the impossible. For now the battle had paused, but the war was far from over. The horizon drifted through the darkness of space, its once proud engines humming weakly after the desperate jump. The ship was battered, its hull cracked in places with systems barely holding on. Silence fell over the bridge, save for the occasional hum of flickering lights and the soft sound of the crew's breath. Xantha Theron stood at the helm, her gaze fixed on the empty expanse beyond the viewport. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally, but there was no time for weakness. The Federation had survived the rift. For now. But survival wasn't enough. They had to regroup, rebuild, and figure out what came next. "Commander," Maris's voice cut through her thoughts. The distress signal was picked up by a nearby relay station. "We're being rerouted to the Federation's recovery fleet. They'll have resources for repairs, but it'll take time to reach them." Xantha nodded absently, her mind racing through the aftermath of the battle. The Federation had lost many ships, and Valora Prime was still teetering on the edge of annihilation. Worse, the rift was still a mystery, an enigma that had proven more dangerous than anything they had faced before. "What's the status on the Dominus?" she asked. "We lost all contact after the rift," Maris replied. "The ship is presumed lost. Relith, if he survived, he's out there somewhere, but there's no trace of his fleet. The Imperium may have been fractured, but it's too early to know if they've given up." Xantha's jaw clenched. Relith was no ordinary adversary. His ruthlessness had been a driving force behind the Imperium's near domination of the galaxy. If he was alive, the war was far from over. "Keep an eye on the sensors," she ordered. "If anything shows up, we'll need to be ready." On an unknown planet. The ground shook with a low, rumbling tremor as a small, barely intact ship scraped across the surface of a barren world. It was the remnants of the Dominus, its hull scarred and barely functional after being torn apart by the rift's destructive forces. The escape pods had long since been jettisoned, but Relith remained, dragging his battered body through the ruined ship's corridors. His uniform was torn, his face bruised from the violent pull of the rift, but his eyes, those eyes burned with a cold fury that refused to be extinguished. He had survived. The Dominus was gone, but he was not. Relith's mind sharpened as he clutched his side, feeling the sharp pain of broken ribs. There would be no recovery fleet for him. His options were limited. His forces had scattered and the rift had done its damage. Yet he was far from finished. His survival was a statement, a defiance of the universe itself. "The Federation thinks it has won," he muttered to himself, a twisted smile curling at the corners of his lips. "But the war is far from over." He looked around the wreckage of the ship, searching for anything that could be salvaged. Deep within the ruins there was a secret, an Imperium weapon that had never been used. It was a last resort, a weapon of unimaginable power, something that could change the balance of the entire galaxy. If he could find it, if he could unlock its potential. The pieces began to fall into place. Relith wasn't just planning his next move. He was preparing for the return of the Imperium. And this time it would not be defeated so easily. On the horizon, Xantha stood before the communications console, staring at the stream of data flowing across the screen. The message she had received from the Federation recovery fleet was simple, but it held a glimmer of hope. They were being assigned to a high-security sector to regroup, to rebuild. It was their only chance to lick their wounds and prepare for what was to come. "Commander, we've received word from Federation Command," Maris called out. "They're sending a convoy of medical ships, repair drones, and additional fighters to reinforce us." "Good," Xantha said. "It'll be enough to give us time to get back on our feet." But even as she said it, she knew that time was not on their side. The Imperium might have been decimated, but there were always remnants, rogue factions, loyalists who refused to bow to defeat. They would rise up. And Relith, if he had survived, would return with a vengeance. "We also have something else to consider," Maris added, his tone more serious. "The rift. The scientists are still analyzing its effects, but we know one thing, it's not just a random anomaly. It's an artificial event, something built by an ancient race." Xantha's brow furrowed. "What are you saying?" "The rift wasn't just a weapon, it was a doorway," Maris continued. "And if someone knows how to control it, they could use it to manipulate space itself. They could change the course of entire star systems. Even conquer new galaxies." Xantha's pulse quickened. Who could have created something like that? "That's the question," Maris said, shaking his head. "And if the Imperium somehow got their hands on the technology, they could be planning something far worse than we imagined." Aboard the Federation Recovery Fleet? The Cascadia, the flagship of the Federation Recovery Fleet, loomed large in the distance, its gleaming hull a symbol of hope. Xantha's ship slowly approached, its broken system still struggling to remain stable. As they drew closer, a voice crackled over the comms. "Horizon, you're clear to dock. Welcome back, Commander." Xanda let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. It wasn't much, but it was a step forward. The Horizon docked with the recovery fleet, and Xanda and her crew made their way through the halls of the Cascadia. The tension was palpable. Even though they were safe for the moment, the war was far from over. The unknown threat of the rift, combined with the lingering shadow of the Imperium, cast a dark pall over everything. Xanda arrived at the command center, where Fleet Admiral Elena Torin stood waiting. Torin was a seasoned veteran, known for her sharp mind and cool demeanor. But today there was a glint of concern in her eyes. "Commander Theron," Torin greeted, her voice grave. "I've been briefed on your report. We're facing a crisis unlike anything we've encountered before. The rift is only the beginning. We need to find a way to control it, or destroy it, before it becomes a weapon of unimaginable scale." Xanda nodded. "I've seen it firsthand. It's not just a force of nature, it's something someone created. And I'm afraid we haven't seen the worst of it yet." Torin's eyes narrowed. "And Relith?" "Still alive," Xanda said with a clenched jaw. "He's out there somewhere and he's already planning his next move." Torin sighed heavily. "Then it's time to prepare for the next phase of this war. We'll rebuild, we'll fortify, and we'll make sure the Imperium never rises again." Xanda stood tall, her resolve unwavering. "We're not just rebuilding, Admiral. We're going to stop them. This time we finish it elsewhere." In the depths of an ancient, forgotten base on the edge of the galaxy, the technology that had once opened the rift was being resurrected. Hidden in the shadows, a figure watched the monitors flicker to life. A new dawn was on the horizon, one that would change everything. The Federation's victory would be short-lived. And soon, the galaxy would feel the weight of the true storm that had been unleashed. The galaxy, still reeling from the aftershocks of the rift, had begun to find some semblance of peace. The Federation's recovery fleet had managed to repair the Horizon and its sister ships, and Xanda Theron stood on the bridge of her vessel, staring out at the vast expanse of space. It was quiet now, too quiet. She knew, however, that beneath this fragile calm, a storm was brewing, a storm that could tear everything apart once again. "Commander," Lieutenant Commander Maris said, his voice tense, "we've received a message from Federation Command. They're preparing for a full-scale offensive to retake lost territories. But there's something strange." Xanda's heart skipped a beat. "What's strange?" "The Imperium's fleet, what's left of it, hasn't been completely destroyed," Maris explained. "In fact, we've picked up a signal. It's faint, but it's coming from a planet on the edge of the Forsaken Sector." Xanda's mind immediately flashed to Relith. The man had survived the rift. She knew he would because he was relentless. If there was one thing Relith understood, it was how to find power in the chaos. And the Forsaken Sector was a region of the galaxy known for its ancient ruins, technology older than any known civilization, remnants of a time long forgotten. "I need a tactical briefing now," Xanda said, her voice sharp. "We're going after him. On the planet of Shardis." Relith stood in the heart of the ancient facility, his hands resting on a smooth, crystalline surface. The ruins of Shardis were unlike anything the galaxy had seen, a city lost to time, built by a race whose name had been erased from history. The technology buried beneath the planet's surface was the key to his plan. He had survived the rift, but the Imperium was broken. His fleet scattered, and the remnants of his empire had been reduced to a handful of loyalists. But here, on this forgotten world, he had found something far more powerful than the weapons of the Imperium. This was a weapon of creation and destruction. Relitha's eyes glinted with the cold, calculating precision that had earned him his fearsome reputation. He had discovered a way to manipulate the rift. Not just to create it, but to control it. To use it as a gateway, one that could rewrite the fate of entire star systems. He could invade, conquer, reshape the galaxy as he saw fit. But first he needed to test it. The ground beneath him trembled as a massive structure powered up, its ancient machinery coming to life. A beam of light shot into the sky, disappearing into the fabric of space itself. Relitha's lips curled into a smile. The rift would bend to his will. And with it he would reshape everything. On board the Horizon, Xanda stood before the command table, her crew assembled around her. The map of the Forsaken Sector glowed on the screen, showing a series of star systems, dead worlds, uncharted anomalies, and the mysterious planet Shardis. "It's clear the Imperium has found something," Xanda said, her voice grave. "Relith is alive, and he's not just hiding. He's planning something. We need to intercept him before he has a chance to fully activate whatever he's discovered. Commander, we're reading a massive energy spike near the planet, Maris reported, his eyes scanning the data on the screen. It's the same signature as the rift. Whatever he's doing down there, it's directly tied to the rift itself. Xanda's mind raced. Prepare for immediate jump. Set course for Shardis. All hands, battle stations. The horizon roared to life as the ship's engines flared, the stars outside stretching into streaks of light as they accelerated toward the Forsaken sector. There was no time to waste. On Shardis. The beam of light in the sky grew brighter, casting an eerie glow across the darkened planet. Relith stood in the center of the ancient chamber, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the rift unfold above him. The immense power of the rift, once an unpredictable force of nature, was now under his control. It bent to his will like an obedient servant. "You've done well, my servants," Relith said coldly, addressing the small group of loyalists who had gathered around him. "This weapon will ensure that no one will ever challenge the Imperium again. The Federation, the galaxy, they will fall at our feet." One of his officers, a tall woman with short-cropped hair, stepped forward. "My lord, the Federation will come for us. They won't let this go." Relith turned his piercing gaze toward her, and for a moment, the officer faltered. "Let them come. When they do, we'll be ready. They think they can destroy us. They're wrong." The officer hesitated. "But, the rift, my lord, it's still unstable. We don't know what will happen when you activate the core." Relith's lips curled into a dark smile. "The rift is mine to command. It will serve us. We will not only control the galaxy, we will control the future." On board the Horizon. The ship dropped out of warp space, and the crew was immediately greeted by the sight of Shardis looming large on the view screen. The planet was shrouded in a faint, otherworldly glow, and the energy readings coming from the surface were unlike anything Xanda had ever seen. "Commander, we're in range," Maris said, his voice tense. "We're reading intense gravitational fluctuations. This isn't just a planetary anomaly. It's a rift." "I know," Xanda replied. "Relith is playing with forces he doesn't understand. We can't let him activate that weapon." Suddenly, the communications console crackled to life, and a familiar, cold voice filled the bridge. "Commander Theron," Relith's voice echoed through the speakers. "I knew you'd come. But you're too late. The Imperium will rise again. You cannot stop what has already begun." Xanda clenched her fists. "We'll see about that, Relith. I'm not here to negotiate. We're shutting this down." The final battle. The Horizon descended toward the surface of Shardis, its weapons primed for the battle ahead. The energy from the rift twisted the atmosphere, causing violent storms to rage across the planet. But Xanda's resolve was unshaken. They would stop Relith no matter the cost. As they neared the planet's surface, the Horizon was rocked by a sudden blast. A series of Imperial warships emerged from the shadows, their weapons firing on the Federation ship with brutal precision. Defensive maneuvers. Xanda barked. "Target their engines. Disable them but don't destroy them. We need answers." The battle raged, but Xanda remained focused. She knew that Relith's ultimate weapon was still out there, deep in the heart of the planet. And they had to stop it. The ground beneath them trembled as the rift's energy reached its peak. The planet itself seemed to come alive, pulsating with an unnatural power. Xanda stood tall, a single thought running through her mind: this ends today. With a final, desperate push, the Horizon broke through the Imperial defenses, landing near the center of the rift's energy source. Xanda and her crew stormed the ancient facility, determined to put an end to Relith's madness. In the heart of the temple, Xanda faced Relith one final time, his eyes blazing with dark determination. "This is where it ends, Xanda," Relith sneered. "You cannot stop the rift. It is my gift to the galaxy." Xanda met his gaze, her voice steady. "You're wrong, Relith. The rift is a curse, not a gift. And it ends now." With a final act of defiance, Xanda activated the device that would shut down the rift's power, destabilizing it once and for all. The rift's grip on the galaxy began to falter. As the ancient facility collapsed around them, Xanda made sure Relith would never rise again. The galaxy had faced its darkest hour, but the Federation had stood strong. The rift was closed. The Imperium was no more. And the galaxy, though scarred, was finally free.